Good morning, everyone. Great to see you here this morning. Before our symposium begins, the Dallas Morning News has a special presentation, and here is Morning News editor Bob Mong.
Thank you, Larry. It's been a privilege working with the Institute and others on this program. My notes reflect that we began hatching ideas for today last December 13th at a lunch at the Meddlesome Moth. At that lunch, among the people at that lunch was Thomas Wong, our Sunday and Enterprise editor, and also the leader of our JFK 50 project. Thomas is one of the most thoughtful and insightful editors in the country. He's a great teaching editor, and his work is full of precision, owing in no small part to his 2 engineering degrees from MIT. And Thomas is going to introduce an important video.
Thank you and welcome. As part of our year-long series on JFK 50 at the Dallas Morning News, we had a very simple idea, and that was to think about the community, to send reporters and videographers to churches and synagogues, to ask people to share their memories of that fateful day. We found that some people hadn't talked about the assassination in years. And some folks even heard stories from their friends that they hadn't heard before. And some even wept as they told their stories. So this very simple idea became something very deep and emotional. We wanted to bring people together and not divide them through shared memories and reflection. We wanted to try to build communities and help communities to heal through storytelling. And we wanted to record oral histories so that people generations from now could understand what it was like back in 1963 and what it's like today. I'd like to ask the people who spoke to us in our videos to stand and be recognized right now. Could I ask you all to stand and let us see you out there? It really meant a lot to us at the Dallas Morning News that you would share your stories, and you can find all of those videos at jfk50.com. We'd like to show a very short film that talks a little bit about those videos, so let's get that started right now.
The presidential car moving out. Head out for downtown Dallas.
There's certain events in your life, no matter how long you live, you're always going to have a memory.
Thousands should already be on the street right now.
I was as close as I am to you right now.
Waiting for a view of the president and his wife.
It was very exciting.
3 shots reportedly were fired at the...
It was the most emotional day I will ever experience in my life.
Most Americans of a certain age know exactly where they were on November 22nd, 1963.
Was on Stillings watching and waiting.
You know, I was at Parkland Hospital working as an x-ray technician. I was at the Love Field Airport.
But if the answer is Dallas, chances are they've kept those memories private. Now, 50 years after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the Dallas Morning News visited congregations across the city and asked North Texans to share their memories. For many, it was the first time they had spoken publicly about that day.
It was so surreal. And I remember we just stood there, just this belief that we had just seen him. And I remember thinking in my head, but we just saw him. You know, this could not have happened.
Being a good East Texan, I felt hurt. I felt anger that in all places, Dallas, Texas. So there were a lot of questions in my mind as well. Why would someone dislike an individual enough to go and shoot them. That was troubling to me to try to understand it.
Very emotional for me, and I'm not a crier. I mean, I'm really not. It's just that a man that I had admired and respected so much, in fact, the only Democrat I ever voted for in my life, that it brought me to tears. And I still get emotional about it just thinking about it. Even right now, I'm getting kind of emotional about it.
Janice, Billy, and Stan were among many interviewed who gathered for a Dallas Morning News sponsored dinner to share their stories with one another. Bob Mong and Tom Wong came up with the idea for the citizen interviews.
Well, this is a deeply personal project for me. I was born in Boston a year after President Kennedy was killed, and my parents were young immigrants from China coming to Boston for school. And JFK was huge for them, as well as the people in Boston. And now, almost 50 years later, just seemingly by coincidence, I'm in Dallas. I'm a journalist, and of course I'm fascinated by the story. And I've always been interested in using journalism as a way to learn about history and its impact on a community.
When we started to conceive this idea of going into the churches and talking to people about their experiences in 1963 and how they worked through them, we had no idea what that journey would take us on. Many people who have witnessed the videos online and read the stories in the paper can say that it's exceeded our expectation.
Over dinner, the group shared with one another the stories they shared with us in our interviews. A common theme was the impact the assassination had on Dallas.
Politicians in Dallas were concerned about the impact economically and politically as well that the assassination would have on Dallas, Texas. Dallas was a very powerful city and was really coming into its own as a great city. And so it caused a great deal of hurt. It caused a great deal of effort to go forth to try to overcome.
I was angry that this had to happen in a city like Dallas. I was angry because I thought of all those school children that couldn't wait to be able to see the president and to be able to be close up and personal with something like that, to have to remember the tragedy rather than the good part of it. I think I was upset, and then I was angry. I was very angry.
Afterwards, it just seemed like Dallas became almost dirty. I remember there was a lot of hate going on. I remember when we went back to school, there were kids that, because of their parents, had said he had deserved it. And to me, it was just such a tragedy.
The stories from Billy, Stan, Caroline, and Janice are all on our special website, jfk50.com, along with the interviews of 40 other people.
Thank you, Bob Mong and Tom Huang, for that inspiring film. Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being with us. This is the Dallas Institute Symposium, Understanding Tragedy, the Impact of the JFK Assassination on Dallas. I ask you to silence your phones if you haven't done that yet, and I would also ask our speakers and panelists to join me on stage. Thank you. First, I want to thank a few of the many who have made this event possible. Our symposium partners, first and foremost, Bob Mong, Tom Huang, Allison Draper, and their team at the Dallas Morning News, and also KERA, the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, University of North Texas Mayborn School of Journalism, and the Ochberg Society for Trauma Journalism. I want to recognize and thank our symposium underwriters, Dee Dee and Rusty Rose, Mr. Jack Matthews of Matthews Southwest, to whom we are grateful for this amazing and very Texas venue. Dr. Nancy Kane Marcus, the Arthur E. Benjamin Foundation, Dr. Joanne Stroud, Ms. Kim Jordan, and our other generous donors listed in your program. Thanks also to Karen Blesson and Mauricio Navarro for the impressive artwork from their Dallas Love Project. And I want to thank the leadership of the Dallas Institute, led by our board co-chairs Russell Bellamy and David Griffin, for its full-hearted support of this event. Finally, I greatly appreciate the presence of our mayor, the Honorable Mike Rawlings, as a member of the symposium team. He'll join us in just a few moments. And I welcome other esteemed city and civic leaders among our audience. It is altogether fitting and proper that during this 50th anniversary year, we should dedicate a day to reflection and conversation about an event that changed everything in Dallas and throughout the world. We come together today not as experts or specialists, but as fellow citizens and guests from other cities who have pondered this death as both a cause of anguish to our city and also a grievous wound to a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that the twin democratic ideals of liberty and equality are worth the greatest sacrifice. President Kennedy's death 50 years ago was a tragedy in the true sense of that word, a word that comes to us from the ancient Greeks, their stage plays enacting a people's loss of their leader, the grief and soul-searching that follow, and finally their reconciliation with the fateful event as they seek to imagine a new and different future. The ancient Greeks' phrase for the cleansing process, the catharsis depicted on stage and simultaneously occurring in the audience, was suffering into truth, a difficult but necessary journey. Today we will be unscripted, hopeful that something of this cleansing action may happen among us as we are thoughtful but spontaneous, open to both seriousness and humor, respectful of the occasion and of each other in both our speaking and our listening. We have no objectives other than that we should follow honestly and candidly the direction that the spirit of the day itself shall present. As citizens, like members of the Greek chorus, let us summon the best in ourselves in keeping with the meaning of this memorial time. It is my pleasure now to introduce Dallas' own Lee Cullum, one of our true treasures and sources of wisdom. Lee is a career journalist who contributes columns to the Dallas Morning News and commentaries to KERA, and is host of KERA's CEO, a series of interviews with leaders from the world of business. She has done regular commentary for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer and National Public Radio's All Things Considered. She was editor of the editorial page of the Dallas Times-Herald and also edited D Magazine. She has appeared on ABC's Nightline, CNN, MSNBC, and various TV programs in Europe. She has won numerous honors for her work and is widely sought as a speaker, advisor, and board or council member. Lee is also a fellow of the Dallas Institute. Welcome, Lee. Come and begin our symposium.
Thank you, Larry. You're characteristically generous. A law was made a distant moon ago here. July and August cannot be too hot, fat chance of that. And there's a legal limit to the snow here in Camelot. The lyrics are by Alan J. Lerner, set to music by Frederick Lowe in a show called Camelot. It was a soundtrack that Jack Kennedy used to play in the evenings when he was winding down, And it is the name that Jackie Kennedy, in a long interview with Teddy White, shortly after the assassination, affixed to the 1,000 days and a few more that her husband was President of the United States. The Kennedy era came to a violent and bitter end here in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. It shattered the city, and it scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts, as the Book of Common Prayer tells us can happen. Ever since then, Dallas has been searching for some dark meaning in that dreadful day and struggling for redemption. So we have here today a number of people who have thought deeply about that search and about that struggle, and I think it's very important and fortunate for us to be able to hear from them today. You know, we are breaking these deliberations into 4 groups, into journalism, politics, the arts, and religion, the impact of the assassination on each. We'll have special sessions this afternoon that will be moderated by 4 very special people. George Getchow of the University of North Texas, the Mayborn School of Journalism, will chair the journalism session. He was with the Wall Street Journal. Best of all, he works in literary nonfiction, which means that need not be a contradiction in terms. And we'll be delighted to hear more from him. Randy Gordon of Gardner Wynne Sewell will chair the politics session. He has a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and that's in law, also a PhD in English from Kansas, the University of Kansas, which means that he is equipped to speak not only on the law, but also on justice. Chris Boyd of Think, the program on KERA, will chair the arts session. She's been called by D Magazine the best broadcaster in Dallas, radio broadcaster, and everybody at KERA is very proud of Chris and proud of her work. Dr. Dan Russ is here to lead us through the session on religion. He's a fellow of the Institute. He is academic dean at Gordon College in Massachusetts, and he runs Christian education there. And now and I want to add that we are really sorry that Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison couldn't be with us today. We were counting on her for politics. We'll miss her here, and I, for one, miss her in the Senate. Maybe some of you do, too. Yeah, thank you. I'll tell Kay you said so. Turning to the group here with us on the stage, Jim Lehrer is well known to all of you. He has co-anchored the News Hour with Jim Lehrer, now called the PBS News Hour. He helped create the program. He's very creative. He helped create a program in Dallas called Newsroom, which some of you may remember. Mike Granberry said he was a freshman at SMU and watched Newsroom. He went to SMU very late. Jim also, you may not know, was with the Dallas Morning News and the Dallas Times-Herald. He has written close to 25 books. I have every one of them. I've loved every one of them. The latest is called Top Down. It's a novel about the assassination, and fascinating reading. I've just started. I can't wait to get back to it. Hugh Aynesworth is here today also. He was with the Dallas Morning News November 22nd, 50 years ago. He didn't have an assignment that day because his beat was aviation and science. Nonetheless, he was not one to miss anything, so he went downtown. And as it happened, he saw the killing of Kennedy. He saw the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald, and then he also saw the shooting of Oswald himself. He has written a book about that called November 22nd, 1963, Witness to History. And I have to tell you, Hugh, I'm staggered by the detail in that book. He is a reporter's reporter. And as Jim Lehrer said on the jacket in a blurb, and I'm paraphrasing Jim, we were all proud of our work that day, but it was Hugh's story from day one. And if you read his book, you'll understand what Jim meant by that. Michael Granberry was in the 6th grade at the time of the assassination. He did grow up and go to work for the Dallas Morning News. He's worked for every section there. And as a consequence, he has a wide-ranging approach to the column he writes, and also a depth of expertise in a startling number of areas. Go look on the front page of the Dallas Morning News. His story is there today on the assassination in the excellent coverage that the news has given this anniversary. And I think you'll enjoy that piece as I enjoy everything that Michael writes. Nikky Finney is absolutely dynamite. Her poetry is unbelievable. I can certainly see why she won the National Book Award for Poetry in 2011. She's just dazzling. She's not afraid to wade into anything, including Katrina. I want to tell you a little bit about her. Her father was a civil rights attorney in South Carolina. He spent a lot of time at the jailhouse getting people out of jail because they'd been demonstrating for civil rights. He became the first African-American Chief Justice of the state of South Carolina. All three of her brothers are lawyers, but she, thank heaven, became a poet. And she is guided by a postcard that a friend sent her from her deathbed, a wonderful short story writer named Tony Cade Bambara, and it said this: Nikky, do not leave the arena to fools. And she has not done that, and I'm very glad of it. Will Power is a startling theatrical talent. He's at the Meadows School of the Arts. His latest play is called Fetch Clay, Make Man. It's just been done by the New York Theater Workshop. It's about Muhammad Ali and a match he fought against Sonny Liston and won in 1965. We are doing the 60s today. It is not only about that fight, but about a very strange friendship between Muhammad Ali and an actor named Lincoln Perry, whose movie name was Step and Fetch It. They were an odd couple, and you've written a play I can't wait to see. Dr. Gail Thomas is co-founder of the Dallas Institute. She's a fellow there now. She runs the Trinity Trust and is working with incredible determination to revive the Trinity River. She was instrumental in the building of the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge. It's magnificent. And it's very appropriate for Gail to have done that because she is in every way a builder of bridges in her life and in her work. Fred Turner is at the University of Texas at Dallas. He was born in England. He grew up in Zambia, which then was Northern Rhodesia. He has an amazingly original turn of mind. His latest book is called Epic. He examines 40 or so world epics and has discovered great similarities among all of them. And all of them, he said, they all have to do with our struggle to become human. But Fred, you said something some time ago I have never forgotten, and it is this: the past breaks the shackles of the present to create the future. And I hope that's what we can do today. Over here we have the Reverend Zan Holmes. Where is Zan? He's down there. He's a longtime friend of mine and of Jim's and many of us. In 1963, Zan was only 5 years away from becoming a state legislator. A wonderful legislator named Joe Lockridge died in a plane crash. Zan took his seat, served 2 terms plus that unexpired term, and did an extraordinary job, all the while running his church, St. Luke's Community Church. And he's been an important moral force in Dallas for many, many years. He will be in the religion section, and I will come back to the religion section, but first I want to talk about politics. And we expect Mayor Rawlings, as you know, look forward to having him, and Margaret Spellings will also be talking about politics. She runs the Bush Foundation, which encompasses, I intended to say, the Bush Institute, Archive, and Library. She also was Secretary of Education under Bush, and she knows a great deal about schools, everything about schools. So maybe she can confer with the mayor when he arrives. He's been working very hard to shore up Dallas schools, and it is backbreaking work, as we all might know. Stephen Carter, I'm so happy to see you. He is a professor at the University of, at Yale University. He also writes for Bloomberg View. And he has written a number of nonfiction books, and if you look at those titles, you will see a chronicle of all the vexations of our own time. One is called Confirmation Mess, cleaning up the federal appointments process, certainly needed. Another called Civility, Morals, Manners, and the Etiquette of Democracy, and I wish there were such a thing. Don't you? God's name in vain, the wrongs and rights of religion and politics, the violence of peace, America's wars in the age of Obama. I think if you read him, you will understand all this troubling us today. He also writes thrillers, and we're thrilled that you're here today. Stephen Carter, welcome. Richard Rodriguez, sitting right next to Margaret Spellings. You know from the NewsHour, he has done a number of essays there, and I have to say his writing is absolutely scrumptious. He went to Stanford. Stephen went to Stanford also. Stephen majored in history, and Richard, I have to tell you, brings us philosophy and Renaissance literature. I'm so grateful for that. I read yesterday the Times at Stanford is devoted now to science and engineering, as all the campuses are, so I'm really happy to have the voice of literature and the voice of philosophy and the voice of history heard here today. Richard's latest book is called Darling. It's a series of essays. There's a wonderful essay in it called Ojalá. Ojalá is Spanish for the Lord be willing and the creeks don't rise. And Richard has traced that back to its Arabic origins, Inshallah Allah, Insha'Allah. And he is studying Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the great religions of the book, the great religions of the desert. And he too, like Gail Thomas, is a bridge builder. No doubt about that. Alyce McKenzie is at Perkins School of Theology, and she teaches the art of preaching, including preaching on controversial issues. You might confer with Reverend Holmes about that. I think if she were going to preach today, the text I would choose for her is from Jeremiah. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered old Zion. I think we've done a lot of weeping about Dallas as we remember it, as we thought it was before the assassination. Father Rudy Garcia is rector of the cathedral in the Arts District. It's called the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. He is in a critical place at a critical moment, and so his is a critical ministry, and thank you for being here, Father Garcia. Katie Sherrod is a longtime friend and associate. She's a commentator, a producer, a writer, and most importantly, she is head of communications for the Diocese of Fort Worth, and there's been a lot to communicate over the years. Katie has seen that diocese through a sea of troubles and landed on dry land safely. We hope you'll do the same for us today, Katie. We're so glad you're here. Turning now to Jim Lehrer. On November 22nd, 50 years ago, he was at Love Field. He was supposed to cover President Kennedy when he landed, having flown over from Fort Worth. It was a very brief flight. Quite unexpectedly, he went on to Parkland Hospital, and by that night, he was at the Dallas jail. Jim, how does that day resonate for you at this moment?
Lee, there are two small events that stick in my mind from that day, that day as a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald, covering the Kennedy visit, keeping in mind that the Kennedys were only supposed to be in Dallas for 2.5 or 3 hours. It was a luncheon event. The Times-Herald was an afternoon paper. Everything was happening right on our deadline. The entire city staff was involved in covering the Kennedy visit. My assignment that day was to cover the arrival at Love Field and to stay there and cover the departure. An event happened that is relevant, I think, and underlines the theme of this event. I finished, the Kennedys came, the motorcade was formed, and they went away with the sound of motorcycle sirens, etc. I stayed, had an open telephone line right there by Air Force One and by the fence, and I finished everything I had I gave to the rewrite man on the telephone, every morsel that I could come up with, every note that I had, so so anyhow, I stayed there at Plainside for some time, and then I casually walked into the terminal building to have lunch, where there were some other reporters. We had already agreed we would meet and have lunch. I walked into the restaurant. The second I walked into the restaurant, a waitress came in. She was screaming. She was in tears. She said, "They shot Kennedy and Connally too." I immediately ran back outside into the hallway outside the restaurant, and there was a payphone on the wall. Grabbed it, I don't know, it's a miracle when I think about it now. I got through immediately to the city desk and immediately to the city editor, Ken Smart. I said, "Is it true?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, what's the deal?" He said, "We don't know yet. Go by Parkland." We sent some other people to Parkland. Parkland, as everybody in Dallas knows, is very close to Love Field. And he said, "And then go to the police station." I hung up the phone, and I was about to leave the phone, and I picked up the phone again, and I called my wife, Kate, who I knew had taken two of we now have three, but at that time we had two little tiny daughters, and I knew she was going to take them to Lemon Avenue, which was just 3 blocks away, to see the beginning of the motorcade, but I knew she had time to be back home. She answered the phone. I said, "Have you heard?" Kate said, "Yes." And I said, "Let's get the hell out of here as soon as this is all over." And she said, "Yes." And I hung up the phone. Incident number 2, at the police station, several hours later. The scene at the police station has been described at the 6th floor museum and elsewhere as chaos. I would say chaos to the 100th power. I have never been involved in anything like it. The cross currents and the cross collisions of emotions, Secret Service agents, FBI agents, cops, sheriff's deputies, and reporters of all sizes, descriptions, and accents. We were milling about. Sometimes we would stop and say, "Good God Almighty, do you believe it? Could it really have happened? Is Kennedy really dead? And did they really kill him here?" And then there would be grief would just come over us. And then all of us had jobs to do. We had to find out what the hell had happened and why, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We were milling about. I was milling about. It was about 8 o'clock. It was all I remember for sure that it was dark. That's all I know. It was about 8 o'clock, and I was milling about along with everybody else. And there was a guy standing there who, as my recollection is, he was an FBI agent. But I don't know that for a fact. He was just standing there, and he was just kind of staring off into space. And as I walked by, he kind of shook his head, and he said, "Things will never be the same." And I stopped, and I don't recall saying anything, but I remember thinking, "Oh my God, yes." But he had to go about his business, and I went about my business, and I realized today that things have not changed. I mean, things have changed in the 50 years since, and one of those things, of course, was the practice of journalism in Dallas and in America.
Thank you, Jim. Everything did indeed change that day. We're going to turn now to Stephen Carter. Stephen, I want to go to one of your novels. It's one of the early novels, The Emperor of Ocean Park. In it, you have a character named Talcott Garland, and he remembers advice that his father, a federal judge, frequently gave him, which said you have to draw a line in life, put the past on one side, the present on the other, and decide which side of that line you're going to live on. And I'm paraphrasing you. So which side of that line will you speak from today, or maybe both? Oh, excuse me, Mayor Rawlings has just arrived. Welcome, Mayor. We're glad you're here. Thank you for coming.
I should start by saying that I was 9 when Kennedy was shot, and I have 3 crystal clear memories of that day. If some of you saw the piece I did in the Dallas Morning News, you know that my elementary school had let out early for some other reason. We had a half day of school, and I was at the barber shop, and it was the first time I'd ever gone to the barber shop by myself. Or that is without my parents. I was there with a couple of friends, and the news came on the screen while we were there. And so one of my crystal clear memories of that day is we had an interesting discussion. There were 3 or 4 of us boys there. None of us knew who the vice president was. We didn't know his name. The second thing I remember is arriving home and my mother in tears. And the third thing I remember about that day is the newsboy. We had newsboys in those days. Knocking on the door, ringing the bell of our house, because he had an extra to deliver of the Washington Evening Star, as it was known in those days when newspapers used to have extras. I think that for people who lived through it at any age, the assassination of President Kennedy is something where we'll never be able to draw a line, and maybe that's good. There are events that happen that it's important to put in the past, and there are events that it's important to put in perspective. And it's important, I think, for all of us to recognize, and I know we'll be talking about it all through the day today, the continuing effects of the Kennedy assassination on our lives, on our culture, on our religion, on the way that the news is covered, and certainly on our politics as well. That Kennedy was not the only president to die in office, but he was the only one to die in office in the lifetime of most of the people who are here. There are some here, no doubt, who remember FDR, but even FDR died of natural causes. And the assassination came at a moment when America was at its mightiest, when we were unrivaled in a sense, economically, militarily. There was this enormous confidence that there was nothing we couldn't do. And I don't think it would be right at all to blame the assassination for the unraveling of that confidence. That was going to be a matter of the historical forces anyway. But it is remarkable how we begin to see a lot of the unraveling so soon after the assassination. One of the continuing effects in politics, and I know people have been talking about this through the day, is how because of Kennedy's assassination, because of his unfinished presidency, because no one knows what his second term, that he had one, would have been like, that everybody in politics, certainly each party, claims his mantle in some sense. His image is so enormous and his presidency so complex that Republicans and Democrats alike appropriate pieces of his image and say, look, we're standing in Kennedy's shoes, following in his footsteps, and so on. Those complexities, I think, strengths and weaknesses, there certainly were weaknesses, a lot of them very well known, but those strengths and weaknesses are things that it's important to keep in mind. He was a complex man, it was a complex presidency, and even as we argue over his legacy and continue to mourn his passing and the passing of that era, it's important not to make him larger than life. It's important to mourn him precisely because he was human, precisely because he had strengths as well as weaknesses, precisely because of his complexity. For me as a child at the time, of course, he was oversized. He's the first president of whom I had any consciousness. I have memories of the Eisenhower years when I was a little boy, but I have no memories of knowing that there was a president named Eisenhower at that time. My father worked in the Kennedy my father worked in the Kennedy administration and loved that man dearly. And many years later, my father, late in his life, referring to Kennedy and his brother Bobby and Martin Luther King, my father, in explaining why he wasn't interested in politics anymore, and he was a lifelong ardent Democrat, he said, everyone I believed in, they killed. And I think there are people, maybe even now, who have that view, and that's a tragedy in and of itself, one of the perhaps continuing tragedies from that tragic day.
Thank you, Stephen. We turn now to Nikky Finney. Her latest book I want to tell you a little bit about is called Head Off and Split. And what she's writing about is buying a fish on the South Carolina shore. If you buy a fish, you ask if the head be cut off, you don't want to see the head on the plate, that it be split and deboned. And she said it's a lot like poetry. You have to decide what to cut out and what to leave in. So Nikky, what are you cutting out? What are you leaving in as you think about the assassination?
I was 6 years old when President Kennedy was assassinated. Shortly after that, I started walking around my South Carolina landscape with a tiny spiral notebook tucked in my back pocket and a sharpened pencil over my ear. And I started taking notes on the world. Here are some notes that I hope lead to this afternoon's further conversation about art, humanities, and who we are as a country. The black and blue limousine, his head full of Massachusetts hair always in place. Her raspberry pink dress with matching raspberry pillbox hat, later lost at Parkland and never found. The mystery black 20-something couple that no one has ever been able to find, who were sitting there on that bench that day, eating hamburgers and drinking out of a glass bottle of Coke that would later explode on the sidewalk as first they waited on their president to ride by, as next they tore off running. The 8-year-old black kid who was interviewed because he must have seen something from how close he stood, how he was questioned, then released, but never had a name. The beautiful sepia brown box of books in the book depository that shielded the hate and steadied the arm of the killer as he took aim through the window. What kind of books were in those boxes? What did they say inside those books about American history, about the science of the body, or about black holes in space? Were these books still sent out into the world as textbooks to teach children around the country something they would need to grow and survive? JFK, MLK, RFK, RFK, MLK, JFK. The music of standing up and fighting back has F and K notes peppered throughout. The president's plane arriving with him alive and departing with him dead from Love Field. Understanding any tragedy means after you dry your eyes and you pay attention to everything, even words, especially words. Does anyone care, as we understand tragedy, that this is the best name for any airport in the world? Does anyone dare say that understanding tragedy means that when you can look at the horrific thing in the eye, you weep, you hold your breath, then you hold on to the names of airports named after what binds us to this earth? You locate the things you must hold on to. You release the others like a bouquet of birds into the sky. You only begin to heal through courage, not fear. I would like to speak with you at length this afternoon about courage, about the birth of art and the search for truth that happened deep inside a tall black girl from the deep blue South during the decade of assassinations that began with the one that took our collective breath away, but did not kill us too. It is always left to the living to not be killed over and over again, let's say 50 years after, by the same bullet.
I told you, didn't I? I hope those weren't Texas textbooks in the bag that you were talking about, at least not some of them that we hear and read about. Richard Rodriguez, you have said that the power that the young have over the old is the spirit of an age. John F. Kennedy embodied the spirit of his age. Stephen Carter has said that when John F. Kennedy left, optimism left with him. How do you look at the spirit of the age and that loss and what it meant to you and what it meant to the nation?
Well, the first thing I want to say, and without embarrassing myself or you in the audience, is that most of us who remember that day are getting closer to our death ourselves. We are now in the last decades of our lives. And I notice in this audience how few young people there are. The task of the old, in this case, in a state of oblivion, a state of amnesia, which I've always thought Texas, and I say this admiringly as a Mexican-American who comes from a death-besotted culture. Today in the Mexican calendar is the Dia de los Muertos. And in Mexico, people are eating skulls, candy skulls. American young people are beginning to turn on to that Mexican habit. The Dia de los Muertos, as Halloween, is becoming a young person's festival, quite unlike anything we knew as children ourselves. On November 22nd, 1963, I was in Sacramento, California. It was a cloudy day. It was a Friday. One of my memories of Dallas that day, as many decades later, September 11th in New York, was that there were no clouds in the sky, that nature did not cooperate with tragedy that day. And suddenly there was this event in French class, this shocking news given to us in English. I went home to an empty house. I was the first one home. The house was cold. I turned on the television. Already, the event was a televised event. We belonged to a generation already that was to view death on the screen. And there was Walter Cronkite choking back the tears as he announced, in a telegraphic style, almost a 19th century style, the news from Dallas, apparently true. It seems to me that the news of Lincoln's death, which passed in telegraph lines, passed in newspapers, had already become a different kind of event in Dallas that day. It's hard not to read history backwards now, as late in our middle age, I now see the Kennedy death through the prism of the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., the murder in Memphis, the murder of Bobby Kennedy in Los Angeles, the 2 attempts on the life of Gerald Ford, the wounding of Ronald Reagan in Washington. There's a photograph on the wall of this room of parents shielding their children at the sound of gunshot, shielding their children on the lawn of Dealey Plaza. And now that photograph looks as modern as yesterday in Los Angeles. Something opened that day in America. Some violence walked through the room, and it walked into the room, and none of us are the same because the president died. Now the roadsides are filled with homemade shrines because a boy was killed there at that intersection. But that day, the most protected, the most prominent citizen shot down. The legend that passed about all the way to California about Texas, about this city, was that this city was a city of hate. I've always thought that to accuse a city of hate is unfair, but it is because there were too many people in Dallas that day, too many people weeping, too much sadness in the city to call it a city of hate. But nonetheless, one can say about the city, how do you remember death in this city? Or how did you not remember the death of that day? People come from all over the world. I have stood with them in Dealey Plaza. There is nothing to see. It is a vacancy. And it seems to me, at the best, what I've admired about Texas, as I've admired about America as a Mexican, is your capacity to look away from the past if it is too painful, to look forward. I was in Houston some years ago trying to speak to a preservation society in Houston. Can you imagine a less likely task? A city that bills itself as a city of the future. Where is the past in Houston? For an immigrant coming to this country, the thing that blows on you, as the wind that blows on you, is this focus on the future. That is your gift to America, it seems to me. The immaturity of America is that you cannot deal with the past. And this attempt of us, of ours today, this attempt of people who are beginning to anticipate when we will be the past, to remember for children who are not here, for grandchildren who aren't interested in us being here today, our grandchildren who are chewing on the candy skulls of Mexico. We are trying to tell them to do something that we have not successfully done in 50 years. We are telling them to remember death. All we did in the years after the Kennedy assassination was to imagine conspiracy, as we are imagining conspiracy after 9/11. It is as though the only way we can make sense of the silence of tragedy is by chattering about conspiracies. Something large happened in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, under a blue sky, a cloudless day in autumn. And in all the years since, we have not learned the language of grief and the language of remembrance. That's why I'm here today.
Thank you very much, Richard. Hugh Aynesworth, reading your book, I am reminded of Dallas as it was in 1963. There was a smooth surface, or so it seemed, an awful lot of nice and decent people. It was a relatively small city at the time, a population of about 680,000, not a big city. But underneath this smooth surface was an undercurrent, even an undertow that threatened to pull everybody under and almost did. I think it was encapsulated in the incident that involved Adlai Stevenson. And you interviewed Stanley Marcus. It's quite a remarkable interview that's in your book. Wonder if you could tell us about that.
you know, the acoustics aren't the best, and I couldn't understand exactly what you said. Could you repeat it?
Oh, the question. Oh, well, I'm asking you about the interview you had with Stanley Marcus, who was looking after Alyce Stevenson on UN Day when Stevenson tried to make a speech but was hissed and booed, and they finally left. I didn't know until reading your book that when he was hit in the head by a picket carried by a woman who was the wife of an insurance executive, it wasn't just kind of an accident. He went over, I read this in Hugh's book, he went over and asked her politely, "Why are you screaming at me?" And she bopped him on the head. What did Stanley tell you about that?
Well, Stanley said he was scared to death. He was actually driving Alyce Stevenson, and after that situation, they shouted him down first. And Alyce Stevenson said, "Do I have to come here from Washington to teach you manners," or something of that sort? And that quieted him for a little bit. And then as they left, Stanley said, "We've got to get out of here." And as they left, the woman hit him with a sign, and another guy threw a sign at him. And Stanley said he was so scared, and he said Alyce Stevenson was livid and scared.
You know, Lady Bird and Lyndon Johnson in 1960 were pretty much mobbed by a bunch of junior leaguers trying to cross the street from the Old Baker to the Adolphus Hotel. And Johnson said afterwards, "How can nice people, attractive people, be so desperate and so discourteous?" And it sounds like that's what was going on that night. But Gail Thomas, you were very eloquent in D Magazine in its recent, very good special issue on the assassination. And Wick Allison, if you're here, I appreciated your story about my uncle Bob Cullum. That was nice of you. He would have loved it. But Gail, back to you. You said that catharsis is necessary for a city and has never been experienced here in Dallas. Why does it matter, and why has it been avoided?
This is very hard, I think, for many of us, because my sense is that Dallas has not wanted to, I call it just from my psychology background as an archetypal psychologist, we've not want to own the shadow of the assassination. And in a sense, we've been a city without a shadow. I wrote a paper called The City Without a Shadow, and gave it on the eve of the 35th anniversary of the assassination, and said it took 25 years for Lyndall and Adams and Conover Hunt Jones to raise the funds in Dallas to open the 6th Floor Museum. And amazingly, and the reason is that people in Dallas, most people that I spoke with, did not seem that it was the right thing to do to talk about the assassination. You know, let's move on, let's build, and actually that's what happened. Dallas built shiny buildings. Almost all the buildings built in Dallas after the assassination were mirrored glass buildings. We know that the freeways were built after the assassination. We sped up the building and the creative life of our city, and yet, excuse me, and yet the communal body of our city atrophied. People stopped coming downtown after 1963. People stopped coming downtown to eat or to go to the movies or just to be downtown. Downtown, within 15 years after the assassination, was abandoned. The office buildings, the old red brick office buildings, were mothballed and then began to be torn down. There was that sense of the heaviness was not acceptable, and we had to build and soar and achieve and be a powerful city. Now, I understand why, and most of us in this room have been part of that effort, and I applaud Eric Johnson for his goals for Dallas and guiding us so carefully through this labyrinth of trying to get out of this dark shame that we felt as a city. Now, this is not a popular view. I have a close friend who said, "Oh, don't talk about the darkness. Don't talk about the shame." That's been our problem. I feel that we must own the shadow of this assassination. In psychology, the shadow is what carries the soul of the place. There's a myth I'm going to go into this afternoon, Nikky, and thank you for your poem. Oh my goodness, thank you. And it's the story, it's a Richard Strauss opera called The Woman Without a Shadow. And she cannot conceive a child, and it's not until she gains her shadow that she's able to conceive a child. And every time in the Richard Strauss opera, the word shadow shows up in the libretto, the music moves to the perfect fourth. In other words, the shadow is where the creative life is held. It somehow is the seed, that creative spark that's waiting there. It's the soulful place. It's like the dark cave we're afraid to enter is where the treasure is. Or we say in healing work, the wound is always where the healing is. And so after the 6th floor was opened, Dallas started coming back to life. Downtown buildings were occupied. Life began to appear again in our city.
Life began to appear, and Mayor, you appeared, and I know that you have given a lot of thought and energy. You've talked to a lot of people to try to understand the proper and appropriate way to observe this anniversary. What has guided your thinking? What has guided your thinking in developing a plan for how Dallas is to observe the anniversary of J.F. Kennedy's death?
Well, I remember also when I heard the news, I remember more vividly when I decided to run for mayor and realized that the 50th would fall within the 4 years that I served, because I realized this would be an important date for all the reasons that have already been talked about. We wanted to make sure that we did two things. One, we represented the authenticity of the city in the right manner, and that we did it in an honest manner where we didn't throw things under the rug. At the same time, we felt this was our chance to say thank you to President Kennedy in the way that this city needed to do. And using history as a backdrop, I don't think we ever have gotten a chance to do that. And so focusing on the life and the legacy of President Kennedy, bringing Dave McCullough, I will have a few comments. Pastor Holmes will have a benediction. We want it to be simple, thoughtful, but we wanted to salute what we feel was a great president. Through that process, a simple process, I think a cathartic experience has happened to all of us because we've had to ask very important questions. And to me, one of the most important questions is, what is the so what for us today? Obviously, this is a history-changing event, someplace between it's a combination of a Greek, tragedy and an Agatha Christie novel with great whodunit. I mean, everybody's focused on this. But what is the so what for us as a city? What is our civic responsibility in dealing with this? I believe that somehow we've got to understand extremism, what extreme thoughts do to a group of people. and how we can go off the rails of civilized behavior when that happens. And I am pleased for this discussion, for the discussion that's happened in so many other places. The second is this notion of what hate and what love is. I think the poignancy of Love Field has always been there for me. I'm so happy to see the thousands of pieces of art saying that Dallas is now a city of love. It's just people saying that and having that discussion about what the history of a city, a country, in dealing with something that none of us had anything to do with, but owning up to that, I think, is important. So hopefully through this event, other things will come, and the world will get a better understanding of what Dallas is in the year 2013.
Thank you, Mayor Rawlings. Margaret Spellings, I want to talk a little bit about a class that Dr. Larry Allums has been teaching at the Institute. It's called Understanding Tragedy. He has his students studying Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, Julius Caesar, and he gave a lot of us a copy of the Oresteia by Aeschylus, a terrific translation by Robert Fagles. But Larry's point is, as he has related it to me, is that when the king dies, when the king is killed, it's a devastating thing, a catastrophic thing for the nation. And I'm wondering, how long do you think it took this nation to recover from this catastrophe? Do you have any sense of it? When do we regain our optimism, which Stephen Carter tells us, and correctly, that we lost?
Well, I don't think we have. I think if we had, we probably wouldn't be sitting here. And I don't think maybe we shouldn't, heal fully, is I think what I would observe. For my own part, I was 5 years old living in Canada with my parents, and I remember it being translated, this hasn't been mentioned yet, that our Catholic president was killed. My family is devoutly Catholic, and I remember seeing it through that lens, not just as a tragedy. I remember feeling my parents completely rattled, and how, as a child, I felt so insecure to see adults for the first time lost by this event. I have recently moved to town just a few months ago, and wondering what the heck am I doing up here with all these really smart people. Of course, leading the Bush Center, we are thrilled to welcome lots of people from around the country and have had more than 200,000 visitors since May. But the #1 tourist attraction in this town, I'm told by the director of the library, is the 6th floor museum, with more than 500,000 people visiting every year. And what does that say about what people want to see when they come to Dallas and do see but the 6th floor museum? And I think in the point you made, Richard, about moving forward is, this is a symbol of a different president, a different place, and another dimension to the story. Just one quick story I want to say about my own interface with the Kennedy family. One of the great professional experiences I had was to work with Senator Ted Kennedy on the development of No Child Left Behind, and I'll never forget, in my early days at the White House, finding a quote from President Kennedy about our need to serve every child, but his suggestion that we test children and that we make the results transparent, and we hold it up, and we hold ourselves accountable for the achievement of every child. This was a radical idea. It was a radical idea in 2000. It certainly was long before then. And I remember talking with Senator Kennedy about that. But I tell that story because I think we all, and still, see the President Kennedy as a historic figure with a policy agenda and a policy contribution that has lived on and has anchored work since that time. And I'm proud that some of the things that we attempted to do were part of that echoing back of his contributions. So thank you for the opportunity.
And as I recall, President George W. Bush used the desk of President John F. Kennedy, isn't
He
that
did,
right?
as many presidents have.
Yes. Fred Turner, right after the assassination, a year or so after, many, many books appeared. One of them was it was a slender volume called Kennedy Without Tears. So I thought we might take a moment and look together at Kennedy Without Tears. It occurs to me that he didn't, and I want to know what you think, he didn't really become king until the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. 1961 was a terrible year for him. He had the Bay of Pigs in April. Not long after that, a disastrous summit with Khrushchev in Vienna. The Berlin Wall went up on August 13th, 1961, and in June, Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State, wrote to his friend Harry Truman this: he manages somehow to be a president, but only the appearance of one. Well, that was a bad year. He was really Prince Hal struggling to become Henry V, it seems to me. How do you feel about that? Does that make any sense to you? He did become Henry V. He did fight at Agincourt.
Well, I was at the University of Oxford when it happened. It was 3 days after my birthday, and it was as if the hope of that whole time had been destroyed. We looked in Europe to Kennedy as the liberator, as we had this vast, terrifying presence to the east of us. I remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I and some of my friends gathered together in my rooms at Oxford, and we got a bottle of sherry, and we were going to watch the nuclear explosions going up over the nearby American Air Force base. When it happened, we expected that we would die at that point. There was that apocalyptic sense. We felt that we'd been saved from that. And then when Kennedy died, it looked like a kind of a victory for that vast and terrifying totalitarian system to the east of us. When I came to America, I little thought at the time that I would become a professor in the humanities at the university of that city, of the city of Dallas. What I found when I came here was this very strange thing that in some ways it appalled me, that in fact it was Dallas that was getting the blame. That Dallas got the blame in many ways in the rest of the country for what had happened. The city of hate, the sense of shame. I didn't really understand it. I thought, why is everybody repressing who and what Lee Harvey Oswald was? And I find Gail's analysis extraordinarily compelling. And I would go even further and say something like this. Tragedy, the heart of tragedy is irony. And what irony is, it's a reversal of our expectations leading to enlightenment. And the irony, the deep irony of what happened was that I think Dallas accepted the blame, even though in a strict technical, historical, factual sense, it didn't deserve it. It was as if Berkeley were to accept the blame if a right-wing zealot had murdered a moderate conservative in Berkeley for not being conservative enough, for not being right-wing enough. And then Berkeley gets the blame for being the left-wing killers of this moderate president. I mean, it was strange. It seemed crazy. What I came to realize was something like this, that Dallas actually accepted the blame, accepted the shame, because in some way it matched something that Dallas realized about itself. I think that essentially Dallas did go through the process, a slow process, of acknowledging, as Gail says, its shadow. And one of the strange things is that this city, I think since 63, was probably the fastest growing city in the United States and one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And, you know, it gave us, you know, the integrated circuit and the soul movement, of whom Gail is one of the leaders. Hillman and Tom Moore. It gave us the UT Southwestern's Nobel Prize winners, incredible advances in medicine, communications technology, staggering private art collections, and now the whole arts district. Something very strange has come out of this odd acceptance of the shame, and I hope that we can investigate that in this, I think, very exciting day, for which I thank the organizers.
Willpower, let's talk a little bit about style. Going back to Stephen Carter for a moment, when he wrote that optimism was destroyed when Kennedy was destroyed, he also said that as a result, the World War II generation of leaders had very little to bequeath to their successors. So the baby boomers inherited the tools of governance, but not a style for governance. Kennedy was famous for his style, celebrated for his style. Why does style matter?
I think inherent in style is content. The way you do something, the way you talk about something, I think is connected to what that something is. And I think going to Dallas, you know, I am very, very fascinated by the stories and the past. What also fascinates me is how the Kennedy assassination affects the young people, or doesn't affect the young people. And I think the image that young people have in Dallas of themselves and relate to the city has an impact for how they feel about themselves, how they produce educationally, how they produce spiritually. When I first moved down here, I'm a recent transplant. I moved down here a year ago, and I always ask all the artists, what's going on? That's just how I do it, you know, what's happening, you know, what's going on? And a few different poets and a few different conversations, young poets, good young poets, said, nothing, man, I mean, it's terrible down here. You know, Kennedy got shot down here. And I was so surprised. These were poets in their 20s that didn't live, they were born in the 80s and 90s, and yet this event still affected them. And you want to get back to the irony of it. I went to one of these poetry readings in this city that supposedly nothing's happening, and it was a phenomenal reading. People were reading, there was energy, so it's something that things are happening, like he said, but oftentimes it doesn't meet our self-perception of what is. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done on that, you know. Yeah.
Well, about style, just one thing. I have a sense that what matters about style is style keeps fate at bay. Style mocks fate. And John F. Kennedy did that to the very end. Zan Holmes, on the night of Kennedy's funeral, the very night of Kennedy's funeral, and this is in a book by Nick Kotz, a friend of Jim's and mine. It's called Judgment Days. It's about Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson and how they worked together. Lyndon Johnson tracked down Martin Luther King. It was not easy, but Johnson could find anybody, anywhere. He found him at the Waldorf in New York. He was huddled with a group of his compatriots trying to figure out what a Johnson presidency would mean to their project. Well, they found out very quickly. Johnson said, I intend to pass the Civil Rights Bill. It was bottled up in the House. This was public accommodations, restaurants, hotels. He called Kay Graham, another friend of Jim's at the Washington Post, said, please help me get this out of committee. She said, I will. He called Richard Russell to the White House, to the swimming pool, said, I mean to pass the civil rights bills. Russell said, it'll kill the Democrats in the South. Johnson said, I don't care. He passed it. Sure, and then came voting rights in 1965, still controversial in Texas, as we all know, and also the open housing legislation. Surely you preached about this in your pulpit at that time. And you've preached about it a lot since, I would imagine. What did you say? Zan Holmes on the civil rights legislation of 64 and 65.
I apologize. I'm not hearing much of
That's okay. You can say
anything
whatever
that
you want to
anybody
say.
is saying, and probably it's my fault. Forgive me.
Let's talk about Lyndon Johnson.
I was at the trademark event waiting for President Kennedy to arrive. And I remember shortly after I sat down at a table there, the announcement came that he had been assassinated. And what I remember is that the food that was left on the tables, I never saw so much food left over. Nobody could eat anything anymore. We did not need physical food in that moment. We needed soul food, food to feed our needs. It was a moment of helplessness when we were stripped of all pride, all pretension, all prejudice. All we had to offer was our own need. A need that physical food could not provide. Among the responses to the assassination was the fact that some cheered. Bill Holmes preached at North Haven United Methodist Church and said one of his members, who was a teacher, said some of the children in that classroom cheered. Bill Holmes said he did not say all of the children cheered, but some of them cheered. What was behind that? Some cried, and some were challenged to become good stewards of this tragedy. How do we grow through what we are going through? That we're drawn closer to God and closer to one another. There is the tragedy of an assassination, but there is also the tragedy of unlearned lessons. What have we as a city learned from this tragedy that can enable us to grow through what we're going through? And perhaps if there is to be any confession, any repentance, is that we have not been good stewards of this tragedy. And I believe that if we're not good stewards of any tragedy that we experience, if we have not learned the lessons of any tragedy that we have experienced, life's teacher will send us back to repeat the course. Hello. And there is no way to know that we have learned the lessons until our behavior changes. In what ways have we changed to deal with that element of cheering, the element of crying, and the element of the challenge to face this tragedy, because we can't fix it unless we face it. And God forgive us for not being good stewards of this tragedy. I believe that God does not want us to waste anything that happens to us, good or bad. The challenge is, how do we face it and look at it and come out of it a better people, a better city, a better nation, a better world. That's my sermon.
Well, Reverend Alyce McKenzie, you teach preaching. I wonder if you'd like to follow that and tell us how we make good use of this tragedy.
When I was in the 3rd grade, I was standing on the playground of Filbert Street Elementary School in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and a random detail, I was wearing a plaid pinafore. So to me, that is a scene, or what is sometimes called a flashbulb memory, if you're familiar with that term, a flashbulb memory. And a flashbulb memory, well, I don't think that people really are transformed in terms of religious communication and preaching by being told a series of truths or facts. We live by the deep scenes that are within us in our memory, and we live by images and flashbulb memories. And a flashbulb memory is a memory of something that occurred to you that took you by surprise, that had an emotional impact on you, and that had consequences, good or bad. And today, I think, in terms of preaching and communicating and keeping this stewardship going of this tragedy, we are many times speaking to people who do not have the flashbulb memory of the assassination. And so, to my mind, we're called to, not just preachers, but all of us as we keep this stewardship going, we're called to sometimes talk about things that other people wouldn't miss if we didn't. Talk about things that nobody would complain about if we didn't bring them to their attention. And in terms of I'll talk about what I know most, which is preaching. In terms of preaching in a time of crisis, the best advice is to start with naming the pain in the room. But part of that pain is the unacknowledged accountability. Why would someone cheer? Naming the pain in the room, and that's what many people did, many religious leaders did. Rabbi Olin comes to mind, who's often called the conscience of Dallas, Reverend Zan Holmes, and others as well. In thinking over how to respond, though, in these times of unanticipated tragedy, it's really an issue of theodicy, as we would call it, which is why do bad things happen? Why do bad things happen? And the book of Ecclesiastes says that wisdom is a gift from God, comma, but one bungler destroys much good. To me, there is a time for accountability, but it also seems like conspiracy theories are a great answer to the problem of theodicy. Right? Why do bad things happen? Well, it's a conspiracy. We want to blame somebody. It's either God, or it's you, or it's me, or somebody beyond this room. Somebody has to be blamed. And this issue of taking on that shame is really interesting to me, and how we determine rightful shame and accountability and distinguish between the two. So the idea of theodicy, and how do we deal with that? It is perhaps easier to come up with a conspiracy theory than it is to acknowledge that there is an element of randomness and chaos in the universe, and that life is risky business. So that's one theme that needs to be continually reflected on. The rabbis talk about tikkun olam, which is where is God at work repairing the world. The Greek tragedians talked about catharsis, which is a sort of purgation of disordered thinking and negative emotion, which leads to some degree of intellectual clarity and restoration. As a Christian preacher, we would talk about resurrection, which is when the reality of death comes up against the reality that love is stronger than death. So can a city of love overcome the memory and the ongoing reality of death in its midst? And I would say that as a communicator, as a preacher, what I would work on and will work on is discerning in the world flashbulb memories for a new generation of where God is at work in the world to bring about hope, to bring about love, because in the end, resurrection turns out to be the good that can come from unspeakably horrible events, a good that we don't fully understand, but to which we witness with all our being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Father Garcia, when John F. Kennedy was president, there was a remarkable pope in the Vatican named Pope John XXIII. He brought great hope to the church, great hope to the world, just as John F. Kennedy brought great hope to the world. He was a great reformer. And I'm wondering, do you see his spirit alive today in Pope Francis?
Do I see John F. K's spirit alive
Or
in
Pope John XXIII, both of them, the two
well, certainly.
gentlemen named John.
Yes. Well, first of all, I must say I'm one of the youngest, I think, in the panel. I wasn't even a twinkle in my father's eye when this tragedy happened. But as St. Paul says, faith comes from hearing, and much the same venue, same way, I've come to know things and believe things about what happened and about John F. Kennedy through hearing, and about what my congregation says and my people, the people that I serve, say about John F. Kennedy. And certainly one of the things as a Catholic is that he was the first Catholic president, that he proved that one could be Catholic and fully American at the same time, that he was only, I think, the second in presidential history to have a chance at the high office of presidency, the first being Al Smith in New York in the 1920s, but because there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment and questions about, could one be a good American and as well be a good Catholic? There was a lot of fear that, and people would say, would a tunnel be constructed from the White House to the Vatican? Or would then in our Constitution our established religion be Roman Catholicism? Well, I think Kennedy proved that you could be both a good Catholic and a good president, not only a good president, but one of the greatest that we have had. And certainly one of the things that makes him great is his love for those who are vulnerable. He set out with the Peace Corps to help people who were in very vulnerable situations. He believed in Americans being able to think beyond themselves and help others and go to other lands and assist. And so he really believed in the social gospel. After his death, he was awarded the Pacem in Terris Award. And Pacem in Terris was actually, Peace on Earth, was an encyclical that John XXIII had written. Because Kennedy also believed in the value of peace. We were living in very difficult times, facing communism, but he called us all to a common humanity. He reminded us all, he said, we are all mortal, we all breathe the same air, and so there's something that binds all of us together, and so we have to work for peace. The alternative would be catastrophic, it would be devastating. And so he really was an advocate for peace, and in this way he shared John XXIII's dream of peace on earth, Pacem in Terra. And then also, of course, with Pope Francis. Pope Francis is also very much calling us to, in these days, looking out for the vulnerable, looking out for the poor, seeing those as essential values that we ought to embrace. And so there is a similarity, I think, between what John F. Kennedy embodied, what John XXIII preached, and what Pope Francis is calling us to today.
Thank you very much. When Carlos Fuentes, the great Mexican writer, was in Dallas some years ago, he said this: "I'd rather be a Greek than an Aztec. I'd rather wrestle with things alien to me than die of absolute astonishment as Montezuma did when he beheld Cortez." Now, Montezuma didn't drop dead at the moment, but his dying began then. Now, I'm wondering, Katie, Sherrod, do you feel that Dallas and Fort Worth have decided to be Greeks instead of Aztecs?
I think Dallas and Fort Worth haven't ever decided anything together. There's been a friendly rivalry, which I think has benefited both cities. I was 16 when this event happened. I was a junior in high school. I was a Roman Catholic child in a sea of Southern Baptists, and was catapulted instantly into becoming an expert on Catholicism, because there were only 3 of us in Permian High School, which was interesting. I mean, he was our Catholic president, and we were, of course, as devastated as anyone, although I have to say, in this West Texas town of Odessa, I heard no cheering. I heard only grief, and Ector County is the most Republican county in Texas and has historically been so. But there was a true outpouring of grief, but also a turning to the Catholics among them to say, what is this? What is happening now? What does all this ritual mean? Because unlike now, when our news is delivered in 1,000 ways, there were only 3 ways to see what was happening, 3 networks. We were all gathered around the television set, all watching the same ritual, which pulled this nation out of its grief and into a realization of how important ritual is in times of when somebody's torn apart by grief, a way to begin putting things back together. When I was watching all that reporting that made me want to become a reporter, and I did, and eventually went to work for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, where I became friends with people like Jerry Flemons and John McConnell, and people who had covered that event, and in fact who carried Oswald's coffin to his grave because no one else would. The story of that visit begins in Fort Worth, where Jack and Jackie spent the night prior to coming to Dallas. And there was a joyous breakfast that morning, huge crowds waiting to greet him. He was presented with a Stetson, a white Stetson, which he never would put on. I don't think Jack Kennedy ever put a hat on, and he sure wasn't going to start with a cowboy hat. And because I really hadn't been aware of the Fort Worth piece of that story until I began hearing it firsthand from the reporters who had covered it and seeing the photographs and of those faces of those people. And the thought that always comes to me when I see those photographs is a part of a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer: shield the joyous, because there was such joy. And knowing what was going to happen in the next few hours, there's a poignancy about that joy that's hard to watch. And for me, as I read those 2 stories, the stories of what happened in Dallas and the stories of what happened in Fort Worth, the story began in such joy and hope and ended in such tragedy. And I've heard all these stories about Dallas being a city of hate, but I think it was a city of fear. I think it was fear that permeated what was going on in Dallas and where all the extremists were. Fear always feeds the extremists. And I think until we acknowledge that, I mean, hate grows out of fear. Until we deal with the things that frighten us, and they are the same things that frighten the people in Dallas: the fear of the other, the fear of those who look different from me, who believe differently from me, who love differently from me. Those fears are still feeding the extremists in our country today, and if we don't acknowledge that, we're fooling ourselves. you mentioned the concern for the poor. I see a disdain for the poor these days that I find tremendously alarming, and very much as a Christian, very unchristian. I look at Pope Francis as a man, I hope, who can help turn that disdain for the poor around, who can help us grow out of our fear of those others and to do what John Kennedy did call us to do, which was to care for one another, to stand together because together we could accomplish so much. And look what we did accomplish. The moon walk. I mean, how amazing was that? We left our planet for the first time. There were so many wonderful things that we accomplished. And I guess for me, in my generation, there was this determination to continue that optimism, that belief that together we could do amazing things and to resist those forces that would try to pull us apart. And maybe that's part of the Western heritage. You know, there's a saying that says Fort Worth is where the West began and Dallas is where the East peters out. Now, there's a lot of humor in that, but there's also a lot of truth. Dallas does look to the east more than Fort Worth does. Fort Worth is a Western city in the sense that it does feel that there are unlimited boundaries, that there's nothing that can hold us back, that we can move forward and do all sorts of things and quietly go about doing that. Dallas has accepted the role of scapegoat for so long, and a scapegoat is an incredibly important role to be played when tragedy happens. The scapegoat is where we deposit all of our fear and our hate and our sin, and let the scapegoat carry it and then be destroyed, and then maybe new things can happen. So I really resonated with what you were saying about that acceptance of that role. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for this city. I think if Dallas will name that and own it and realize it can be an instrument of transformation, amazing things can happen. Dallas might even become as wonderful as Fort Worth.
Michael, if you were going to write about this for the Dallas Morning News tomorrow, what would you say?
Well, there have been so many moving stories and experiences here. It's really been fascinating to hear what everybody has had to say. But one of the primary thoughts that I had listening to everybody, I was 11 years old when the assassination happened. I was in the 6th grade. It was exactly 1 week from my 12th birthday. And we were told, we had the news confirmed for us by a gym teacher at the 5th period gym class. Gym class had started with one particular child standing up and celebrating the fact that Kennedy had been shot. I only saw one child do this, but I saw it with my own eyes. And this angered the gym teacher to no end, and he began a kind of sermon, which I'll never forget. He said, not only was the president assassinated, and then he pointed his finger at us and said, but it happened in your hometown. You'll never get over the fact that it happened in your hometown. And I never had, and I never have, and what was interesting to me about that experience, you hear this phrase a lot, the loss of innocence. For me, it was really the death of innocence. There was one particular life that was lived up to that point, and there was a different kind of life that occurred after that. What's been fascinating about some of the people that I've interviewed over the years about the assassination, two people I thought about a lot as I was listening to everyone else. In 1982, I had always heard about a game the Dallas Cowboys played in Cleveland 2 days after the assassination, National Football League Commissioner Pete Rozelle refused to cancel the weekend's game. So the Cowboys, as fate would have it, had a road game. And they were not treated well. And Don Meredith had always been my childhood sports hero. I always wanted to ask him about that game. So in 1982, he graciously consented to an interview. I spent about 4 hours with him at his home in Beverly Hills. Fortunately, I taped the interview. I still have it. And he talked about something that I had experienced. He said that he had a different kind of career and a different kind of life after the assassination, despite the fact that 3 years after the assassination, the Cowboys became a winning team, largely because of him. It was never the same after the assassination. Football was kind of a joyless struggle, and he retired prematurely after the 1968 season. Then later, a few years after that, I interviewed this woman, Ruth Payne, who plays such a central role in the story of the assassination. She took into her home a woman from Russia named Marina Oswald and her 2 children. And she did this completely out of kindness. She helped Marina's husband, Lee Harvey Oswald, get a job at the Texas School Book Depository. And she told me the night that the Dallas police came to her home that Friday night after the assassination, they went into the garage, and Marina was there with them. And one of the policemen held up a long cylindrical blanket, and he said, "What was in here?" And Marina said, "Well, that's where Lee kept his rifle." Something Marina had not bothered to tell Ruth. And Ruth said to me something very similar to what Meredith had said. She said that she, at that particular moment, when she knew that the murder weapon had been in her garage, a different kind of life began for her. One life had ended, another life began. And I realized in doing those stories that I had had a very similar experience, much less dramatic than theirs. But all 3 of us had been touched by the assassination, and we all had that experience of having one life end and another life begin. And I think that's exactly what happened to Dallas. That's what happened to our hometown. One life began, or one life ended, and another one began.
Yes. Well, let it not be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. Thanks to all of you, Jim Lehrer and Larry Wright await you at lunch. Larry Allums will tell you where to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Lee, and everyone. Wonderful program this morning. Everyone should have a schedule, a map. It is lunchtime. I want to remind you that if you have not signed up for either the Focus Forum or the Roundtable, you can do so still if you'd like to stay with us through the day. We'll have a post-symposium reception and wrap-up in the loft upstairs at 4:30. Invite everybody to that. Remember the bookstore with pre-signed books just over this way. And also, I would invite you to share your memories of 1963 in the Dallas Morning News video booth, which can be found in the Music Hall Green Room, and also visit the Dallas Institute's Hyatt Prize table just over here as well. So we'll dismiss now for lunch and then come back as quickly as we can for a lunch program back here with Lawrence Wright and Jim Lehrer. So thank you for being here, and we'll reassemble soon. We're going to take a picture. Hey, Will.